You know, tiling an entry is one of those jobs that everyone thinks they can do because all the materials you need are available at the local home center. And you know what? It is a doable job. But if you expect that tile job to last, you need to know which materials to buy and how to install them correctly. And for that, we brought in a 40-plus year veteran of tile installation, Tom Meehan. Okay, well, we're lucky enough to have Tom Meehan here to help us with this tile foyer. He's been doing tile for 40 some odd years, so he's seen everything. Tom, the homeowners are really concerned about the durability of this foyer. They got a lot of foot traffic through here, 2 dogs. What do we do to make sure that they're in good shape? Starting with the subfloor.
Well, my only concern is that the floor is structurally sound.
Okay, how do we tell that?
Well, you mentioned that there's 1 1/8 to 1 1/4.
Yeah, we have 3/4 plywood with a 1/2 inch on top.
Even though you have that, I like to jump on the floor, see if there's any spring. Just good common sense. This floor is solid. And if you go down here, it's good and clean. My thin set's going to bond beautifully to it.
So we don't need to go around, put any screws in? Do we have to worry about squeaks?
No, walking around, I haven't heard any squeaks at all, so we're fine. If there was, yes, I'd put screws in.
Should we get started then?
Yeah, let's go.
Well, thousands of years ago, the Europeans came up with a system to keep their tile floors from cracking. What they would do was have the cement layer at the bottom, a layer of sand, and then a layer of cement on top that the tile would be bedded into. And what that did was it let that sand layer absorb any shifts in the earth so that the tile floor would stay perfect. Now, we have a modern version of that. This is Schluter's Detra Membrane. It's called an uncoupling membrane. It's got fleece on one side and a plastic waffle grid on the other side. Now, this gets bonded to the floor, the tile gets bonded to the top and the plastic, and this absorbs just like that sand layer did in the old days and keeps the tiles from cracking and the grout joints from popping.
Okay, if you want to step on that piece on the end there and hold this right to the edge. First piece we're doing is 98 inches. Just use the scissors. Don't make the mistake that some people do by using a utility knife out in the deck, because then you're going to put scratch marks right into the planking.
Right, we come to tile the foyer and we end up buying him a new deck.
It happens too.
Installing the membrane breaks down like this. First, in a dry layout, measure and cut the membrane to completely cover the floor. Tom works on large sections at a time, cutting to fit as he goes, and he fills in any remaining gaps using cutoffs. The fit at the walls doesn't have to be tight. About 1/4 inch of play works well for ease of installation. Before removing them, Tom numbers each piece and draws a line on the floor to mark edges. Now he has guidelines for spreading thin set and reinstalling each piece. The type of thin set you use to bond the membrane depends on the substrate. We're going over plywood, so we'll be using latex modified thin set cement. To mix thin set, Tom begins with about 3 inches of water in a 5-gallon bucket. Then he adds a small amount of thin set and begins mixing using a paddle mixer. Adding water first prevents the thin set from clumping and sticking to the bottom of the bucket. Tom works his way from a watery blend to a nice, thick cake batter consistency, adding small amounts of thin set as he goes. Then he lets the mix sit for about 20 minutes, allowing it to firm up. This process, called slaking, will ensure the longest working time on the batch. Well, it turns out that the perfect amount of time to wait for the concrete to start stiffening up is if you quit and have a sandwich. After slaking, you need to mix the batch one more time. Then it's ready to be spread. You tell me what a good amount is.
Just let it go. Go for it. Even more. Great. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to burnish it in first. Push it into the plywood with the backside as well.
Tom works within the lines he drew on the floor, one section at a time. This breaks the job into manageable chunks that he can easily reach without getting his knees in the mud. His first pass is called burnishing, where he uses the flat side of the trowel to work the thin set right into the subfloor. On his second pass, he flips the trowel around and uses the 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch notches to comb out the thin set to an even depth, leaving behind uniform rows of ridges while removing any excess lumps. You want even contact when placing the membrane, so we hover it over the thin set and then lower it into place. Once we're happy with the fit, Tom beds the membrane into the thin set using a wooden float. Always working from the center towards the edges, He leans his body weight into the float, forcing excess thinset out the sides and making a really solid bond with the subfloor. Then, we move to the next section and repeat the process, working our way right across the room. What is that thing?
This is the mason's trawl, which has a point on it, but if you're scooping thinset, I took a grinder and I cut off the front edge.
Oh, so you can get down to the bottom of the bucket.
Right.
As soon as the Detra membrane is in place, you could walk on it and even start laying tile. Well, okay, we got the Detra down, and now Tom's going to show us his layout lesson so that we can figure out how our 8x8 tiles are going to space out. Dry layout is important for two reasons. One, we establish where our cuts will be so we don't end up with slivers of tile or odd cuts at our focal points. And two, we establish layout lines so we'll have nice, straight rows of tile. The first step is to place a straight edge at the front entry running towards the opposite doorway. Then Tom begins to lay pieces of tile, starting with a full tile at the front door to get an idea of how they'll space out. Because the handmade tiles are irregular in shape and often out of square, tile spacers are a no-go on this job. There's nothing wrong with doing a tile layout by eye, and it's typically how Tom works, even with tiles that are consistent in size and shape. So, Tom eyeballs the joints at about 3/8 of an inch and works his way across the room. At the doorway, Tom lays his level across the opening to see how much we'll need to cut from this last piece.
That's great. Well, if there's going to be a wood threshold here, we're going to end up with a 6-inch space. That's perfect.
We're left with a 6-inch tile, more than half of a full piece, so visually, we're in great shape. The idea here is to avoid slivers in highly visible areas. If we had a sliver, we'd simply shift our dry layout so that we start with a half tile or so at the entry, leaving a half tile or so at the doorway. With the length of the room figured out, we focus on laying out the width. Tom begins with a full tile at the base of the stairs, another spot that he considers a focal point of the room, and works towards the opposite doorway. Here we're left with a 2-inch cut, which might look awkward, so instead, we're going to start with a half tile at the stairs, leaving us with equal cuts at both ends. With the tile spacing determined, it's time to mark layout lines. Tom begins by laying 3 courses from the front wall and uses a straight edge to mark the first guideline right on the membrane. Then he makes a second line perpendicular to the first. I've done jobs with and without layout lines, and let me tell you, it's worth the extra few minutes to ensure that tiles are laid in straight rows that don't wander out of alignment. It's pretty good.
It doesn't get any better than that.
Okay, we got our Detra membrane down, we've got our layout figured out, and tomorrow morning, first thing, we start laying tile.